Today we want to dig into what happened during the Spanish invasion of the Americas, where they were able to gain control, why, and if they had help from any indigenous people, who fought them, who gave in, and who lent a helping hand. I'm choosing to use the word invasion rather than conquest. Conquest implies total domination, which would be misleading. In fact, the Spaniards never gained full control over all of the region we now call Latin America. Born in Genoa, his native language was Ligurian, in which he is known as Cristoforo Colombo. In Italian, Cristoforo Colombo, and in English, Christopher Columbus. You may have learned in school that Europeans at the time thought the earth was flat, and he wanted to disprove that, but that is an erroneous myth. Pythagoras in the 6th century BC wrote about the earth as round, as did other ancient Greek geographers and philosophers, including Ptolemy's Geography, of which Columbus owned a copy. When he sailed west, what he did not know was the distance he would have to cross to reach the Indies. Isabella and Ferdinand financed his voyage, and he was promised that he would be given the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea and Viceroy and Governor of any new lands discovered for the Spanish kingdoms. On his first voyage, he sailed to the Canary Islands, already settled by Spaniards, where he restocked supplies. It was then a 5-week voyage until he reached land. He first reached an island in the Bahamas, which he called San Salvador. He thought that he had reached Asia, so he called the people Indios, and he persisted in that belief throughout the rest of his life. The people he first encountered were people of the Arawak family of languages, including Lucayan in the Bahamas. Some had gold ear ornaments, and he took them prisoner so that they would reveal the source of gold. Searching for gold and other riches, he and his men also discovered the islands of Cuba and a large island that he called Hispana, Spain, later named Hispaniola, where Taino people lived, also of the Arawak language family. When he departed in 1493, he left behind 39 men at a settlement they called La Navidad in what is now Haiti. This is a copper plate engraving by Theodore de Brie of Columbus's landing on Hispaniola in December of 1492. I will be showing you many engravings by this same artist, which were made as illustrations for a book called A Brief Account of the Destruction of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas, whose portrait is on the right. More about him later. This is another Theodore de Brie engraving, this one of the Arawaks of Hispaniola. On his first voyage, the Arawaks all maintained peaceful relations with Columbus and his crew. He was very impressed by them and wrote in a letter to Isabella and Ferdinand, quote, "The people of this island all go naked as their mothers bore them. They have no iron or steel or weapons, nor are they fitted to use them. This is not because they are not well built and of handsome stature, but because they are marvelously timorous. It is true that after they have been reassured and lost their fear, they are so guileless and so generous with all that they possess, that no one would believe it who has not seen it. They refuse nothing that they possess if it be asked of them. On the contrary, they invite anyone to share it and display as much love as if they would give their hearts." End quote. Yet Columbus also knew what his royal patrons wanted to hear, and so he added, quote, "And they are also fitted to be ruled and to be set to work, to cultivate the land and to do all else that may be necessary, and you may build towns and teach them to go clothed and adopt our customs." End quote. Before returning to Iberia, he captured more hostages to deliver them to his royal patrons. After Columbus returned and reported that he had discovered lands with rich gold deposits, his royal patrons wanted to finance a second voyage. The Catholic monarchs needed to be reassured that they could claim dominion over these lands. Consequently, they petitioned to Pope Alexander VI, who was understood to be God's representative on earth. The Pope issued a bull in 1493, Inter Cetera, with a grant and also stipulations. It read in part, quote, "That in our times, especially the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to the faith itself. We assign to you and your heirs and successors, kings of Castile and Leon, all islands and mainlands found and to be found, discovered towards the west and south, by drawing and establishing a line from the north to the south, the said line to be distant 100 leagues towards the west and south from any of the islands commonly known as the Azores and Cape Verde." What is a league? It is a nautical measurement equivalent to 3.45 miles. Portugal objected to this papal donation, however. As a compromise, in the Treaty of Tordesillas of 1494, that line was moved to a location 370 leagues west of the Cape Verde Islands. It stipulated the newly, quote, discovered lands to the west would fall under the dominion of Castile and those to the east to Portugal. There was a very interesting unintended consequence of this treaty, as you can see on this map. In 1500, Pedro Alvarez Cabral, sailing southward to go around the Cape of Good Hope, accidentally sailed too far westward and, quote, discovered part of the Brazilian coast. What is now Brazil was largely east of the Treaty of Tordesillas line, and therefore it became a Portuguese possession. This map from 1622 shows that new line of demarcation and how Brazil came to be a Portuguese colonial possession. This map, dated 1502, shows the world as it was then known to Iberian navigators. Note how little was known of the Americas at the time. With Castilian dominion secured, the Catholic monarchs sent Columbus back on a second voyage, this time with 17 ships and 1,200 men. Their initial goal was not to rule the natives, but to set up trading stations so that they could send back more riches to Castile. They soon discovered, however, that there were few trade goods of interest. The Caribbean islands had very little gold at all, and they had none of the spices desired in European markets, nor did they have elaborate craft traditions. Moreover, the Taino were not that interested in any trade items that Columbus's crews had. The Arawak communities were more egalitarian. They were subsistence producers and were not interested in accumulation of status items. Therefore, they could not be induced to much trade. When Columbus's crew's plans for lucrative trade fell through, they shifted tactics. They began to capture natives to sell them into slavery in Europe. They also imposed direct control over native villages, essentially colonization, forcing them to provide them with goods or to work for them. The various abuses they inflicted, including sexual assaults on women, led to native attacks on the Spaniards. The Spaniards then used those attacks as justification for widespread enslavement and forced labor regimes. This Debray engraving was made to illustrate a passage of Las Casas' brief account of the destruction of the Indies, in which he wrote, quote, another time, because the Indians did not give him a coffer filled with gold, they killed an infinite number of souls, and cut off the hands and noses of countless women and men, and others they threw to the savage dogs who ate them and tore them to pieces. End quote. As Bartolomé de las Casas recorded in his book, the Arawak populations of the Western Caribbean experienced severe losses for a number of reasons, including military conflicts as the Spaniards sought to subdue them, and the hard labor into which they were forced. They also suffered from food shortages as they had to produce food for themselves and the Spaniards, all while doing the additional labors such as panning for gold that the Spaniards required. The animals that the Spaniards introduced, including pigs, cattle, and horses, got into the natives' fields and ate and trampled their crops as well. They also died from old world diseases that the Spaniards introduced to which they had no natural immunities. On the island of Hispaniola alone, in the late 15th century, there was an estimated population of 1 million. By the mid-16th century, they were virtually gone. Great losses were experienced on the islands of Cuba, San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. When the Spaniards saw that the natives on Hispaniola were dying off, they brought in natives from the Bahamas to replace them, leaving those islands vacant. Some Christian clergy began to object to the abuses that the Spaniards inflicted on the natives of the Caribbean islands. Dominican friar Antonio de Montesinos, serving as a missionary on Hispaniola, delivered the first public rebuke in a sermon in 1511. He said, quote, "Tell me by what right of justice do you hold these Indians in such a cruel and horrible servitude? On what authority have you waged such detestable wars against these people who dwelt quietly and peacefully on their own lands? Why do you keep them so oppressed and exhausted without giving them enough to eat or curing them of the sicknesses they incur from the excessive labor you give them, and they die, or rather you kill them, in order to extract and acquire gold every day?" End quote. Other friars began to lodge protests as well, leading King Ferdinand to recall all of these friars back to the Spanish kingdoms. When Fray Antonio de Montesinos and the other Dominican friars were recalled to Castile, they were able to have some influence on King Ferdinand and Queen Juana I, now the reigning monarch of Castile. They were in fact worried about the legal justification for military conquest and slavery in the Indies. They were not unfamiliar with military conquest and enslavement. After all, Spanish Christians had waged war and enslaved Muslims in Iberia for centuries up to that point. However, the wars against Muslims were characterized as, quote, just wars because the Muslims, according to the legal theory, had already been exposed to the teachings of Christ. If they knowably resisted those teachings, they were, quote, apostates and could be subjected to military conquest and slavery. However, the natives of the Indies had never been exposed to Christianity, and therefore, as Fray Antonio de Montesinos indicated, they should be given the opportunity to learn it first. Ferdinand and Juana subsequently issued the Laws of Burgos in 1512. These laws provided some protections for the natives of Hispaniola and later Puerto Rico and Jamaica. The protections they were granted were that they should be taught Christianity, they should not be worked to the point of physical harm, they should be permitted homes and lands of their own, and they should not be physically abused, among others. However, these laws otherwise simply provided the legal framework within which the Spanish settlers could forcibly demand native labor. We'll get into the details of those institutions later. As we will see, the legal protections of the Laws of Burgos were regularly flaunted and ignored. At the same time, Ferdinand and Juana required that Spaniards encountering new groups of natives would have to formally give them the opportunity to submit to Spanish rule and Christianity peacefully, but if they did not do so, they would be attacked and enslaved. The Spaniards were required to read a document known as the requirement allowed to them. The document was read in Spanish, which of course the natives could not understand. The document reads in part, quote, "Wherefore we ask and require you that you consider what we have said to you, and that you acknowledge the Church as the ruler and superior of the whole world. But if you do not do this, and maliciously make delay in it, I certify to you that, with the help of God, we shall powerfully enter into your country, and shall make war against you in all ways and manners that we can, and shall subject you to the yoke and obedience of the Church and of their highnesses. We shall take you and your wives and your children, and shall make slaves of them, and as such shall sell and dispose of them as their highnesses may command. And we shall take away your goods, and shall do you all the mischief and damage that we can, as to vassals who do not obey, and refuse to receive their lord, and resist and contradict him." End quote. Stated differently, this document provided the legal justification for continued military conquest and enslavement. As the native populations of Hispaniola and Cuba were dwindling, and as the Spaniards had not discovered the vast deposits of gold they desired, Spanish ships set out to explore the other islands and take people into slavery. One such crew shipwrecked in 1511 on the eastern coast of Yucatan. Two survivors will turn out to be very important in later events. One was Jerónimo de Aguilar, a Franciscan friar, and the other Gonzalo Guerrero. They were captured by a Maya group, and both learned the Yucatec Maya language. Aguilar remained loyal to the Spanish and his Christian vows. Guerrero, however, married a Maya woman and became a war chief for the local Maya ruler. Some years later, in 1517, another Spanish crew came across one of those long Maya trading canoes. It was laden with riches, including gold. They heard tales of rich Maya cities and deposits of gold on the mainland, and they took this news back to their settlement. Armed with this knowledge, Hernán Cortés set out from Cuba with a large crew, determined to discover the fabled deposits of gold. They landed at Isla Mujeres on the Yucatecan coast. Hearing rumors of bearded men, which they assumed to be other Spaniards, as native men tend to have less or no facial hair, they then found Jerónimo de Aguilar, who joined their crew. He became very important because of his knowledge of Yucatec Maya. They sailed along the Caribbean coast, stopping here and there, engaging in trade. When they asked where was the gold, they were always told that it was not there but further up the way, clearly a tactic of deflection. They heard tales of the great city of Tenochtitlan, and they also met with rulers who were enemies of the Aztecs, having met with them in battle. Cortés became intent upon going to Tenochtitlan. This is a painting by José Clemente Orozco called Cortés and Malinche. This woman became incredibly important as Cortés's translator and consort. What her birth name was is unknown. She was baptized into Christianity with the name Marina. She was called Doña, an honorific, probably because she had been a noblewoman. Her first language was Nahuatl, the language of the Mexica. In her youth, she was either sold or captured into slavery. At the time of Cortés's expedition, she was enslaved in the Chontal Maya region. When Cortés arrived there, she was given to him as a gift by leaders at Pontonchan, along with 19 other enslaved women. Because of her, Cortés was able to communicate with Moctezuma. He would speak in Spanish to Jerónimo de Aguilar, who communicated with Doña Marina in Chontal Maya, who would then speak in Nahuatl to people in Tenochtitlan. She was also known as Malintzin, a nickname based on Marina. She is also called La Malinche, and in Mexican lore, she is cast as a traitor. Emperor Moctezuma extended to Cortés a royal treatment. Before they arrived, they were greeted on the road by an envoy who presented them with gifts but tried to keep them away from the city. When they arrived, they were invited to stay in the palaces. You may have heard that the Aztecs believed that Cortés was a god, but that is a myth. That story does not appear until 1552. None of the accounts from the time of the expedition, including Cortés's own letters, indicate as such. While staying in the palaces, though, Cortés and his men held the emperor under house arrest. This image from the Lienzo de Tlaxcala was made in the immediate post-conquest period by native artists who had been taught how to read and write using the Roman alphabet. You can see Doña Marina as translator on the right. After having learned that Spanish forces were on the way to depose Cortés for having overreached his instructions, Cortés and most of his army departed the city. He left behind some of his troops under the command of Pedro de Alvarado. Cortés and his army successfully subdued the Spanish troops who had been sent to arrest him, and they convinced them to join their siege of the city. In the meantime, Alvarado had initiated a massacre of nobles and priests in the city, which initiated a rebellion against the Spaniards. The massacre is depicted in this image from the Lienzo de Tlaxcala. Cortés returned to the tumult in which Moctezuma was killed. The succeeding emperor, Cuitlahuac, chased the Spaniards out of the city. The Spaniards returned, though, and captured the city in 1521. How is it possible that this group of Spaniards captured this city, one of the largest in the world? They had several advantages. First, Cortés had that large number of reinforcements from Cuba, 800 Spanish soldiers. Then he went back to the cities that he had previously visited of people who were enemies of the Aztecs. He recruited tens of thousands of soldiers from Texcoco and Tlaxcala to join in the siege. The Spaniards also had some advantages in military technology. They had built 13 small ships for the attack, which they transported overland piecemeal and then reassembled at their destination. They had gunpowder used in cannons and arquebuses, long guns. They had other weapons of iron and steel, including crossbows, swords, plus chainmail and armor. Their horses also gave them the advantages of speed and height. The Aztecs had bows and arrows, spears, obsidian clubs, and quilted cotton armor, but these were not enough to hold off the invading forces. The Spaniards' deadliest weapon was an invisible one, smallpox. Between the time that the Spaniards had been chased out of Tenochtitlan and then returned in 1521, they had left smallpox behind. The natives had no resistance to this highly contagious disease, and by the time they returned, according to contemporary sources, half of the city was dead, dying, or sick from the disease. They could not put up the strongest defense. Smallpox also played a pivotal role in the conquest of the Inca Empire, which occurred over a decade later. In the meantime, smallpox had traveled far ahead of the Spaniards, making its way from central Mexico through Central America and into the Andean highlands. In 1532, civil war was raging in the Inca capital of Cusco. The emperor, Huayna Capac, had died apparently from smallpox. In addition, his heir died along with other members of the royal family. With the emperor and his heir dead, there was the question of succession. Who should rightly be the next emperor? Two of his sons, Atahualpa and Huáscar, were fighting for the title. Each had their own armies supporting their claim. Atahualpa had imprisoned Huáscar. Consequently, when Francisco Pizarro and his troops entered the region, the empire was greatly weakened. Pizarro led a surprise attack at Cajamarca, which was a site of gold mining, as it still is today. At Cajamarca, he captured Atahualpa. As you might have already learned, he promised to release him if the Inca filled a room with gold riches. They did, but Atahualpa was not released. Instead, he was baptized to save his soul and then killed, as is shown in this illustration from Guaman Poma's book. Pizarro captured and pillaged the capital city of Cusco in 1534, thus decapitating the Inca Empire. However, even then, the Inca were not completely defeated. Prince Manco escaped, and he and his heirs ruled a government in exile until 1572. At that time, Spanish soldiers captured the last Inca ruler, Tupac Amaru, pictured here. He was baptized and then killed. If you ever wondered where Tupac Shakur got his name from, now you know. Even after having seized the capitals of the largest empires, the Aztec and the Inca, the Spaniards had not fully conquered Latin America. Since those empires were so new and they had ruled indirectly through local rulers, there were local rulers who could organize collective resistance against Spanish armies for years. Even in the places that they had subdued militarily, it took a long time for new Spanish institutions to be put in place. It was in fact easiest to subdue dense, compact settlements like Tenochtitlan and Cusco. It was much more difficult to conquer regions where the political organizations were smaller or looser, such as the tribes of northern Mexico, or in what is now the American Southwest, or the Mapuche of Chile, pictured here. It was also difficult to dominate people in regions in which the terrain was difficult to traverse, such as deep in the tropical rainforests of Guatemala or in the marshy swamps of Belize. The Spanish also frankly put much less effort into conquering regions that lacked the type of riches they sought, such as precious metals. Zones in which the Spaniards had little, if any, control became zones of refuge that would be populated with people fleeing Spanish rule. This was the case for what is now Belize. Consequently, some indigenous groups were able to be at least partly autonomous for centuries, carrying on their traditions.